Hi, I'm Jake Yokogawa, and for my presentation, I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of the once consumer electronic giant, Radio Shack. So real quick, here's a table of contents for my presentation. I'll start off by talking about Radio Shack's background, then I'll get into the rise and fall of Radio Shack, and finally, I'll finish with the aftermath and what Radio Shack looks like today. So first, some background. What exactly is Radio Shack? The story of Radio Shack begins in downtown Boston in 1921 when brothers Theodore and Milton Deutschman opened a radio parts and surplus store out of their love for ham radio. They called it Radio Shack, a reference to a small wooden structure that was used on ships to house its radio equipment. In 1939, they entered the high-fidelity music market and also issued their first mail-order catalog. The catalog read, "Wholesale distributors of radio and electronic equipment, amateur and communication supplies, sound systems, and service parts." The brothers saw success catering to fellow amateur radio enthusiasts and radio operators on ships. In 1959, they began selling their own private label products under the brand name Realist, eventually changing the name to Realistic after being sued by Stereo Realist. By the early 1960s, the company was offering numerous consumer electronics like antennas, speakers, and walkie-talkies. However, after expanding to 9 locations, the company faced financial difficulties and was on the brink of bankruptcy when Charles D. Tandy of the Tandy Corporation saw the potential and purchased Radio Shack for $300,000 in 1962. Under Tandy Corporation, which was originally a leather goods retailer, Radio Shack saw a resurgence. Tandy's strategy was to appeal to hobbyists, and he had a vision as to what Radio Shack could become, a mythical place for all things related to electronics, catering to both do-it-yourselfers and anyone in search of the latest gadgets. Stores were employed with people who knew electronics. Tandy got rid of the unprofitable mail order business and eliminated many top management positions, keeping salespeople, merchandisers, and advertisers. Tandy increased spending on advertising and offered bonuses to top salespeople. He also streamlined their product offerings, refocusing inventory on private label items and cutting the number of items carried from 40,000 to 2,500. He sought to identify the 20% that represented 80% of their sales. Another strategy Tandy incorporated was that in order to incentivize working long hours, he required that store managers take an ownership stake in their stores. He said, quote, "We're not looking for the guy who wants to spend his entire paycheck on a sound system, but instead they were seeking customers looking to save money by buying cheaper goods and improving them through modifications and accessorizing, making Radio Shack common among, quote, nerds and kids aiming to excel at their science fairs." So this leads us to the rise of Radio Shack and how they were able to gain monopoly power. As previously mentioned, when Charles Tandy and the Tandy Corporation purchased Radio Shack back in 1962, the company was nearly bankrupt. However, under his rule and his strategy, Radio Shack became profitable again within just 2 years. And within 10 years of the acquisition, Radio Shack was opening 2 new stores every day. If there was one thing Radio Shack knew how to do, it was ride a wave. During the CB radio craze of the 1970s, Radio Shack was a leading retailer of CBs. Also in the 70s, Radio Shack entered the growing computer market, and in 1977, they introduced the TRS-80, which was one of the first mass-produced computers and originally outsold Apple by using the power of its retail channel and its thousands of locations. Unfortunately, the following year, in 1978, Charles Tandy passed away from a heart attack. However, Radio Shack would continue on with operations and in the 1980s, they would enter the market of cellular phones, offering 20 types of home phones by 1982. Then, in the 1990s, the company would focus on expansion, rapidly increasing stores. During the 1990s, Radio Shack was at its peak and completely on top of the electronics world. By 1991, Tandy was the largest manufacturer of personal computers in the world, and they were sold exclusively at Radio Shack. They continued to ride this wave, acquiring competitor Computer City in June of that same year. Radio Shack then successfully shifted their emphasis from components and cables to mainstream consumer electronics. This completely worked out for them, and the 1990s saw great success. At one point in time, Radio Shack was the world's largest consumer electronics chain. In 1998, Radio Shack's stock price reached an all-time high of $78.50 a share. By 1999, Radio Shack was operating over 8,000 locations worldwide in the US, Mexico, the UK, Australia, and Canada. The company had over 7,300 US locations and boasted about how they had a store within 3 miles of 95% of American consumers. While the 1990s saw the peak of Radio Shack's success, it was during that same time period in which the company made a series of unfortunate decisions which ultimately led to its decline. So what exactly went wrong for Radio Shack? There was not one instance that caused the downfall of the once tech giant, but instead a series of missteps from the company that led to its eventual bankruptcy in 2015. The first reason Radio Shack failed is because they failed to adapt and stay relevant, and ultimately fell behind the competition. They first began seeing significant competition in the early 2000s from specialty chains like Best Buy and Circuit City, as well as from mass merchandisers like Walmart and Kmart, as the popularity in electronics increased. Additionally, Radio Shack was late to the e-commerce game, only selling online starting in 2006. And even then, products couldn't be shipped directly to your home, so you would need to pick it up from the nearest store. Thus, because Radio Shack relied solely on its brick-and-mortar sales network, profitability and sales pressures grew as consumers were buying electronic parts and gadgets from online retailers like Amazon and even eBay. Moreover, consumers continuously made complaints that Radio Shack lacked certain inventory. So, for many consumers, Radio Shack became irrelevant, as any electronic part can now be purchased cheaper and easier online. Another reason that led to the failure of Radio Shack was their poor product concentration. From its early successful years, beginning in the 1970s, Radio Shack constantly attempted to go down different paths, jumping from market to market in hopes of riding waves of popularity. They started in radio, then made a shift towards computers, and finally to cellular phones. So, by the 2000s, the company had gone all in on cell phones and accessories, which did see some initial success with sales in Sam's Club kiosks. But by 2014, cell phones alone accounted for about half of Radio Shack's sales, making it an extremely risky proposition of a high product concentration. Then, following the release of the iPhone in 2007, there was a major shift in consumers purchasing phones directly from their wireless operators. Thus, as a result, Radio Shack sales and profit margins significantly deteriorated. The third reason that Radio Shack eventually failed was the fact that they simply had too many stores nearby one another. While this did fulfill the vision of expansion for Radio Shack in the 90s and 2000s, the high store concentration ultimately led to stores cannibalizing revenue from each other, which generated losses. In 2014, Radio Shack was running about 4,300 stores in North America. However, there were many stores that were located way too close to each other. For example, there were 25 stores near Sacramento, California, located within a 25-mile radius. and 7 stores within 5 miles around Brooklawn, New Jersey. With so many stores within such close proximity to each other, Radio Shack experienced a significant drop in profitability and faced inventory problems. So, the thing that Radio Shack once bragged about eventually became too costly to maintain and led to great financial issues. The fourth and final reason that led to Radio Shack's failure is the management problems that the company faced throughout the years. Radio Shack suffered from poor and frankly often overpaid leadership, which could not focus on a single plan, but instead was constantly looking for rescue strategies, changing the direction of the company. From 2005 to 2014, in just 9 years, the company changed its CEO 7 times. In 2013, Joseph Magnacca joined Radio Shack as the new CEO to speed up the turnaround. The company set a goal of restoring profitability by 2015 with a significant store and product revamp changes in compensation structure and aggressive marketing campaigns. However, as Magnacca's effort started to roll out, the results eventually got worse. This is due to rising costs, constantly shifting management orders on short notice, and confusing commission structures. Thus, the end was approaching for the company. So finally, we have the aftermath of Radio Shack. What could they have done to survive, and what does the company look like now? So, in my opinion, there are two main things that Radio Shack could have done to stay alive and on top of the consumer electronics game. The first, and probably the biggest, thing that Radio Shack could have done was to pick a lane and stick with it. As mentioned before, Radio Shack struggled because it could not choose a path, but instead they chose them all. Jumping from one strategy to another without full commitment proved to be a failing business model. The second thing Radio Shack could have done was to get on the e-commerce train sooner and sell online. Radio Shack could have been the next Best Buy. It even could have been the next Amazon had it known to move away from the brick and mortar sales. The lack of online sales allowed competition to catch up and eventually surpass Radio Shack when it should have been at its peak. So, what now? In February of 2015, Radio Shack filed for bankruptcy, and its remaining stores were purchased by General Wellness and leased to Sprint. Then, in March of 2017, General Wellness themselves filed for bankruptcy, shifting business primarily to online. In November of 2020, Retail E-commerce Ventures, also known as REV, a holding company, acquired Radio Shack, and today Radio Shack operates primarily as an e-commerce website, a network of independently owned franchise Radio Shack stores, and a supplier of parts for Hobbytown, USA. In an alternate universe, Radio Shack would rule the world, supplying all of our electronic needs from computers to cell phones and even making them. But instead, Radio Shack is bankrupt, having missed almost every opportunity to be at the center of the technology revolution. And it is just another tale of a business who failed to adapt to the times. Thank you.